Open field about,
I think it was
from our position. Do you see them? Over.
One, roger that.
They've
got out there in the field. They came out of this village as soon as we started checking it out. I'm sure they're aware that there's going to be a little action here, so they're no problem there.
Roll to the right, I'll go hard. Okay, which way? Roll out.
One, roger, and request you
get him.
after this area. We're getting extremely low on fuel. We're trying to hold on until
Get him, Clark.
6 comes back.
Okay, 3-1, we got one.
Roger.
Get in. Okay, 3-1, we got another one. You ready to?
Roger that. Put it on him. Don't hit any women or children or anything, but put it on him.
Day 1 of the Gulf War. Kuwait falls to Saddam Hussein. Iraqi troops prowl for foreigners.
We had Americans stuck all over the country.
While the U.S. girds for war, Saddam hunts down Americans trapped in Kuwait. Clinging to hope, they pray for rescue. The mission falls to a maverick ex-Marine who hatches a desperate plan. Penetrate deep behind enemy lines, dodging terrorists and spies, and bring the Americans home. 4 unarmed men against an entire army. A hair-trigger despot versus America's silent warriors. No one saw it coming.
Nobody in the United States was prepared for the Iraqis to cross the border into Kuwait. We had airplanes flying into Kuwait the day before the invasion as if there were nothing wrong. The ambassador had met with Saddam Hussein some weeks before, and when he told the ambassador he wasn't going to invade, we thought that that was the truth.
Within 12 hours, the battle is over. In one of history's quickest victories, Kuwait is conquered.
On the 1st of August, I went to bed, and the next day I woke up and there was news that there were Iraqi soldiers running all over the place.
And suddenly Saddam was in that country and we had Americans stuck all over the country.
There was a lot of confusion. There were soldiers around, there was shooting, and I stayed away from them. Very carefully stayed away from them.
And if you were able to learn fast enough that that was happening, and you knew the way to escape south across the Saudi border, then you might have been one of the people that was fortunate enough to grab whatever he could, and your family, if you could, and friends maybe if you could, and jump in a vehicle and make it for Saudi Arabia as fast as you could.
I'd have to do it on foot. Maybe there was no car there. I don't think I'd get too far. I didn't look like an Arab. I didn't have any Arab clothes. I just felt like that was the worst of all things to try.
But those who weren't moving so fast, who hadn't thought about this before, or who didn't have a way or know the way, were the ones that were caught in Kuwait.
There was another a fellow in the same like a duplex that we had, and he didn't show up again. I don't know where he went, or if he got out of town, or he just disappeared. So I had the whole building more or less to myself, but I stayed in the one apartment.
Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein orders his troops to comb the streets for foreigners.
By getting a hold of them and controlling them and not letting them leave, he had a bargaining chip in case there was going to be some kind of retaliation. He started putting a lot of them in hotels where he could control them, but at the same time there were a lot of people still in hiding because nobody knew with a certainty what Saddam was going to do to anybody that he had captured.
I was wary. I just didn't want to take a chance. And I didn't think I had to. I think I had patience and I could wait a long time. I knew someone would come and get me.
2 weeks after the invasion, Bill Cowan gets a cryptic call from William Colby, former head of the Central Intelligence Agency.
The man was an absolute legend. He went behind German lines before D-Day, and he went up, dropped behind German lines up in Norway. He had an incredible operational career and a wonderful career inside the CIA. Bill was working with a New York law firm that had long-standing ties to the U.S. government, including the CIA, and a large client list of Fortune 500 companies. Being a good Marine, of course, I went down there the next day. Not sure why he'd called, but ready to do whatever the director wanted me to do.
In his Washington office, Colby offers Cowan a hazardous mission.
There was a Fortune 500 company that had some people stuck in Kuwait, and that's where it all started.
Cowan's job? To quietly get the Americans out. Colby didn't know Cowan, but he'd read his resume. A Marine lieutenant, Cowan served 3.5 years in Vietnam. He commanded an infantry platoon during the harrowing siege of Khe Sanh. Led patrols, ambushes, and raids. Interrogated enemy defectors. And worked with Navy SEALs and the CIA.
And it was all trigger time. I always was carrying a gun, and most of that time was out in the field on operations. So I had probably more experience, combat experience, than any other Marine officer of the era. And all that time, I got a lot of exposure to the intelligence community.
For this mission, Cowan handpicks 2 veterans from his days in covert operations.
My expertise was a military career in special forces and in denied area operations, and also in intelligence work.
One teammate is codenamed Trigger, the other Rex.
The reason I'm in shadow is that many of the people who assist me in my work depend on my anonymity for their very lives. In foreign countries, it would be my responsibility to go into those countries or provide for people going into those countries that would develop information that could be given to our special operations people.
Like the agents of Mission Impossible, Cowan's guys are on their own.
The issue the U.S. government faced in Kuwait was that they couldn't go in and rescue some people and not rescue everybody. We would keep the United States government informed of our general actions, but under no circumstances were we working for the U.S. government, even though we were trying to rescue U.S. hostages. And had we been working for anybody other than Bill Colby, it might have been a problem. But Bill went to the White House early on and met with people on the national security staff and told them, we are running an operation to get hostages out of Kuwait.
As Cowan assembles his team, Iraqi troops scour Kuwait City, searching for Westerners.
There were really 2 kinds of hostages in Kuwait City. There were those that Saddam had already captured, was holding in hotels. He knew who they were, and there were people who were still in hiding.
If they're found, their fate rests with one of the world's worst dictators. In his war against Iran, in violation of international treaty, Saddam Hussein resorted to chemical weapons. 5,000 Iranians perished. When Saddam used poison gas against Iraqi Kurds, over 50,000 were slaughtered. In Kuwait, Saddam's troops value plunder over life.
And so anybody, American or Westerner or even Kuwaiti, caught by these Iraqi troops was indeed at some peril, and it took a few weeks before the Iraqi commanders finally gained control of their troops.
The battle has been joined. No nation will be permitted to brutally assault its neighbor.
Days after the invasion, President George Bush orders Hussein to withdraw from Kuwait. Hussein refuses. To back up his pledge, he commands the world's 4th largest army. Experts predict that ousting Hussein could take months of fighting and thousands of American lives. As America debates the cost of victory, the first troops arrive in the Mideast, along with the body bags. With his team assembled, Cowan sets up base in Cyprus, a launch pad for many of America's secret operations in the Mideast.
The three of us sat outside one of our little cafes along the water and started talking about what was going on and what it is that we needed to do. The first being, we didn't know where the people were inside Kuwait City.
For Cowan's team, the road to Kuwait leads through Beirut.
We spent a lot of time working with Lebanese assets after the bombing of the U.S. Embassy, the bombing of the Marine compound. So we had some Lebanese who we had worked with for years. And really, Lebanese are multicultural international businessmen. Any country you go to, you'll find a large Lebanese population, a very prosperous Lebanese business community. And we wanted to take advantage of those Lebanese contacts to see if we could get back up into Baghdad and then down to Kuwait to start getting into our hostages.
Bill Cowan has been down this road before. The journey back to Beirut will open old wounds and return Cowan to the scene of a tragedy. In Washington, a legendary Marine meets a legendary spy. The ex-CIA director gives Bill Cowan a hazardous mission: rescue a band of Americans from the clutches of Saddam Hussein. Cowan is the right man for the job. His experience in the Middle East begins with another hostage crisis and a mission to save Americans from a tyrant. November 1979. Iranian radicals seize the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and hold 52 Americans hostage. April 1980. A rescue attempt ends in tragedy. In the wake of the disaster, the Pentagon formed several elite counterterrorism groups. The most famous is Delta Force.
There was another smaller, more classified organization inside the Pentagon whose name really is still not supposed to be public knowledge, and I was fortunate enough to be the only Marine that was assigned to that unit.
With his unrivaled record in Vietnam, Cowan was chosen to join America's most classified counterterrorism unit. Within weeks, Cowan faces his first test. In Beirut, a terrorist drives a van filled with 2,000 pounds of explosives into the U.S. Embassy.
Well, Beirut was the center of terrorist activity throughout the world. We had major enemies there inside Lebanon, in the Muslim fundamentalists, Shiites. And this was their one and only way of getting back at us.
63 people perish, including 17 Americans. More than 2,000 U.S. Marines were stationed in Beirut to help keep the peace during Lebanon's bloody civil war. The Pentagon dispatches Cowan's team to assess the safety of the Marine compound. Cowan discovers the Marines are sitting ducks.
There was a lot of intelligence available inside Beirut, but it wasn't moving to the people that needed to have it, and in particular to the Marines out by the airport. We also learned that the Marines were standing security out there without loaded weapons because the State Department was concerned about an accidental discharge, and as a result didn't want Marines, who I might add are pretty highly trained about weapons. They didn't want them to carry loaded guns for fear that something might happen.
6 weeks after the bombing, Cowan's team hands the Pentagon a plan to beef up security. Nothing happens. Summer comes and goes, and Cowan's report gathers dust. In October, Cowan confides his fears to a colleague.
And I told my friend, you know, I'm gonna wake up some morning and I'm gonna turn on the news and I'm gonna hear that 10 or 15 Marines have been killed in a suicide attack.
At 6:17 a.m., while most of the Marines in Beirut are sleeping, a truck loaded with 1,500 pounds of high explosives crashes through the gate of their compound.
I remember exactly where I was. I was in the living room of my house down in Virginia, standing in the living room Sunday morning with my coffee in my hand, and I turned on the news radio station, as I always do in the morning, and the very first thing I heard was that there's been a bombing.
The blast was so powerful, it was the largest non-nuclear explosion to date since World War II. The same type of explosive would be used in the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center.
And they started talking about the numbers of people killed. And the numbers started out small, and throughout the day they grew and grew and grew. And every time I heard another report and another larger number, I got madder and madder.
241 Marines perished. 21 were buried in Arlington Cemetery. Nearby, commemorating their sacrifice, a cedar of Lebanon was planted.
After the bombing, nobody was held accountable anywhere in the chain of command for the loss of those Marine lives.
The Pentagon at last dusted off Cowan's report and followed the recommendations.
Virtually every recommendation. But it was too late. We'd already lost all those Marines.
While the country mourned, President Ronald Reagan vowed to avenge the dead.
We have strong circumstantial evidence that the attack on the Marines was directed by terrorists who used the same method to destroy our embassy in Beirut. Those who directed this atrocity must be dealt justice, and they will be.
A month after the bombing, Cowan returns to Lebanon. Working with the CIA, his team gathers intelligence for striking back at the terrorists. Once again, nothing happens. 4 months after the Marine barracks bombing, Reagan withdraws all troops from Lebanon. Disillusioned by his experience, Cowan left the Marine Corps and joined the staff of a United States senator as a counterterrorism expert.
And ironically, sometimes there is a sweet irony, I got to be involved in the crafting of the legislation that created the Special Operations Command.
7 years after his mission in Beirut, Cowan returns to the Mideast. In the quest to rescue Americans trapped in Kuwait, he's on familiar ground, but on new terms. It's Cowan's plan, Cowan's team, and if it fails, it's Cowan's neck. From his base in Cyprus, he looks up an old friend, an operative from his days in Lebanon.
We called him up in Beirut and chatted a little bit. How are you? How are we? This and that. And the final sentence was, we need to see you in Cyprus, and there's a ticket waiting for you at the airport. And he knew right away that it was another mission, and he was on his way.
When Cowan reports the lead to Colby, Colby reveals a lead of his own.
In the conversation with Bill, we learned that one of the people who was closely associated with one of the hostages, a housekeeper, but not in the context of a cleaning person, somebody who helped manage the household affairs, had indeed made it through Saudi Arabia and was back in Beirut. And Bill had the name and a potential address. We also learned from Bill that one of Iraq's leading intelligence officers was posted at the Iraqi embassy in Beirut. And we decided that we needed to get to that guy.
The next step, slipping unnoticed into Beirut. The cover will be furnished by the president himself. After the Iraqi conquest of Kuwait, scores of Americans are trapped behind enemy lines. But the Iraqis themselves are feeling the heat. At the urging of President Bush, the United Nations imposes a trade embargo on Iraq. The Iraqis probe desperately for loopholes.
The biggest issue for the Iraqis at the outset was food, trying to get food in. So our cover story was that we were a small company with a lot of international experience, and we wanted to help them break the sanctions. As far as they were concerned, our motive was profit. As far as we were concerned, our motive was hostages. When you're running an operation like this, it's important to realize that the bad guys are going to be looking at you, and they're going to be looking at you carefully. And so we needed to set up some kind of operation that looked legitimate. The first thing we did was we set up a small office in Cyprus that looked like a real trading company. We had telephones, and we had faxes, and we had action and activity, and some of those faxes were going to different places around the world looking for commodities and asking for commodities. And then we set up a small operation here back in the United States, which looked the same, so that if Iraqi intelligence was looking at us and was following our phone calls and was following our faxes, that it would look like it was a legitimate operation.
In keeping with their cover as businessmen, Cowan's team decides to go unarmed.
If you somehow get stopped by a security person, as an example, and you've got a weapon, immediately there's the implication that you're doing something wrong. The one time in Beirut that we had weapons with us, which were silenced weapons, ironically, we pulled them. And fortunately, it was an instance where we didn't have to use them, but it just highlighted once again that if you have a weapon, what you might do in a normal situation, if it gets dicey and you don't have a weapon, you think of a way to get out of it. And if you do have a weapon, you'll pull your weapon. And right away, you've raised your profile.
Even with their cover, the team runs a risk entering Beirut. The airport teems with troops and spies from a dozen anti-American militias. Capture means death. Instead, the team takes the ferry between Cyprus and Juni, a city north of Beirut controlled by pro-Western Christians. Aboard is Cowan's teammate, Trigger, on a mission to find the Lebanese housekeeper. Heading for a safe house in Juni, Trigger arranges for Lebanese contacts to drive him to the housekeeper's home the next day. To get there, he must cross the Green Line, the border between the Christian and Muslim sectors of Beirut. The Muslim area is controlled by terrorist militia, including the radical Hezbollah. Trigger's safety is riding on his Lebanese contacts.
They were able to put me in the back of the van, drive me through the checkpoints without being stopped or questioned, through the checkpoints into the southern suburbs to the individual's house.
Very, very important that we find this Lebanese housekeeper. He knew where the hostage lived. He knew what the hostage's habits were. He knew where the hostage might be, since we knew he hadn't been captured by the Iraqis. And he was going to be a wealth of information for us, not the least of which to tell us exactly where the house was, because the maps that we had were a little bit outdated. So this guy was very, very critical to us.
I went up and knocked on the door, identified myself in a different name to the individual. He was initially a little bit nervous and apprehensive until I had a chance to explain who I was and why I was there.
This Lebanese housekeeper had tremendous loyalty to the American that he had been working for.
We had a map of Kuwait City, so he was able to pinpoint the location, and then we were able to sit down and sketch out the environs around the house.
He provided all the details that we needed to be able to find this hostage if he were still hiding where we hoped he'd be. And he also told us who some of the people were in the Kuwaiti resistance, who he thought would be helping this person.
Mission accomplished. Trigger returns to the safe house. Meanwhile, Cowan's contact in Beirut sets in motion the plan's next phase.
Iraq was a closed country right after the invasion. When the world backlash came against Saddam, he shut the country down so people couldn't come and go.
The plan to enter Baghdad begins with a ruse and a bribe. In Beirut, Cowan's team befriends an Iraqi businessman with close ties to the Iraqi embassy. Seduced by a scheme to bypass the trade embargo, the businessman sets up a meeting between Cowan's team and an Iraqi intelligence officer.
We met with the Iraqi intelligence officer at a small restaurant. That is essentially the way people in that area like to do business, is over food. There was small talk for the better part of the lunch. And then I brought up the reason for my being there was that we wanted to make some money out of breaking the sanctions against Iraq and providing them with foodstuffs and other commodities which were in short supply in Iraq.
In the Arab world, where governments control everything, business gets done by pulling strings.
The Iraqi intelligence officer initially said that this would take a long time, although he applauded our goal of wanting to break the sanctions and provide aid to Iraq. This being the Middle East, this is where people bargain and haggle, and it's the land of bakshish. So we bargained and haggled for 15, 20 minutes or so, at which time it became apparent to me that he was very open to a bribe, a bakshish, and I offered him $5,000 for that at that time, and he accepted it.
Within 24 hours, Trigger has the visas to get into Baghdad. Meanwhile, Cowan tackles an even tougher problem: getting into Kuwait and back out with the hostages. He picks the route that's least suspicious and most daring.
And that is to move hostages right through Iraqi forces, back up into Baghdad, and then try and move them from Baghdad out. The Jordanians had kept good relationships with the Iraqis, and they were the gateway to a lot of supplies going into Iraq, truckload and truckload. So the controls at the border were almost non-existent for trucks.
The Americans have now been trapped in Kuwait for 6 weeks.
Well, I just thought our country, if there was we were taken prisoner, or thought that we were being held prisoner, or thought that we would be in captivity in some form, would come there and try to get people out. I knew people knew where I was, but didn't seem anybody would come. They didn't show up. I was living out of a closet, frankly, and any time that I thought there was anybody around, I'd go into the closet, and I never left anything out. I was very careful.
The American Forces, in cooperation with the Veterans Administration, presents You Owe It to Yourself, a program to answer questions about veteran administration benefits. Can I become a veteran?
I had a little battery radio, and I wanted to keep that going as long as I could. And so I used to take that with me. I turn it off for hours on end and just tune it up every now and then to see what was going on. I read a few things. I had some, I occasionally get some papers in with my food. I had a deck of cards. I am the world's leading solitaire player. I played solitaire. I must have played 25 different kinds of solitaire.
The longer somebody was hiding out, the more at risk he was for much harsher treatment by Saddam's people if captured. And indeed, Saddam was threatening to use hostages as human shields.
I heard that he was taking prisoners and using Westerners and using them as shields. And I think I knew somehow or another that he did that before. So I wasn't surprised, and that started to worry me a little bit.
In Saudi Arabia, Allied troops continue to mass for the war against Iraq. Ground zero is Baghdad, the most dangerous place to be, and exactly where Cowan's team is headed. In Baghdad, Rex hopes to gain entree to Iraqi officials and the freedom to travel to Kuwait. To lower the Iraqis' guard, he undergoes a change of nationality. Fluent in several languages, Rex poses as a German working for Summit Systems, the team's dummy corporation.
I was able to get a passport, a foreign passport, based upon my associations with an individual in Paris who could provide such a passport, do some forgery type work.
Totally an illegal operation, but he made some of the best passports that you could find anywhere. And this was the only case where we really broke an international law. We knew it was illegal, Bill Colby knew it was illegal, but it's something we needed to do to get this operation done, and it was worth taking a risk.
Armed with German passports and Iraqi visas, Rex and his cohort Samir land in Baghdad, 400 miles behind enemy lines. Here, they're joined by the third member of their team, the unwitting Iraqi businessman they befriended in Beirut. He still thinks he's meeting with executives from Summit Systems.
Well, my days were spent in contacting and talking to the various Iraqi businessmen and government officials. In addition to that, I used my time in getting to know the city, because I was looking for other capabilities as well, such as a safe house in which to put the hostages once we had gotten them out of Kuwait for safekeeping.
Unsure of the foreigners, Iraqi police keep them under surveillance while checking their story.
I think it was about the second or third day that we were there. Our Iraqi businessman associate was picked up by Iraqi security forces and interrogated. I did not know this until after the fact. He was held for some 5 or 6 hours, questioned about my presence there in the city, what I was doing and what he was doing on my behalf.
They worked him over pretty hard. They beat him and they interrogated him and they tried to get him to talk, and thank God he had no idea at all what we were up to.
The Iraqi businessman was totally ignorant of the true nature of our operation. He really thought we were there to do business, and consequently, that's what he told the Iraqi security officials, and they released him after some fairly rough treatment.
Because after Iraqi security was done beating him and working him over, they too were convinced that we were there to do business.
Business was about to pick up. As the rescue team searches for a way into occupied Kuwait, the Iraqis themselves provide one.
The Iraqis put on a big public relations campaign to make the world believe that Kuwait was a safe and a happy place. And so they were letting people go down into Kuwait City. We wanted to piggyback on that by getting our guy into Kuwait.
After a 6-hour drive from Baghdad, Cowan's teammate Samir is detained at a checkpoint.
We had a real stroke of luck when Samir was stopped at the border. He struck up a friendship with the officer in charge of the border.
At first, the officer is all business. After many questions and a few terse remarks, Samir begins to grow on him. Guarding the border is lousy duty for a frontline soldier. With time to kill, the officer welcomes a captive audience. Samir has come equipped with an icebreaker. Samir has made a new friend.
And we spent hours with him just talking and kidding around and just developing a kind of a cozy relationship that he thought he might need later on. And then Samir went ahead on into Kuwait City.
Following a map drawn by the housekeeper, Samir makes his way toward the hideout of one of the Americans.
And so he went to a public telephone, and the phone system was still working. And he called the number that he had received from the housekeeper, and he let the phone ring 3 times. And he waited 10 minutes, and he let it ring 3 times again. And then he waited another 10 minutes, and he called it, and the hostage picked up the phone and said a simple hello.
When the telephone rang, I just didn't answer the phone. I mean, I was just afraid to answer the phone. And then after a while, I started to measure this thing. And it was in some sort of a code that the phone would ring exactly 3 times, and then it would stop. And then about in 10 minutes it would ring 3 times again. I then stop. So after this sequence went on a few times, I got the idea that maybe I better just say hello. And I did say hello. And on the other end was somebody trying to contact me, talk to me about taking care of me.
Mr. Peters. We put together bio sheets on each one of these guys that we were trying to rescue, and it's important to have that. And you needed to be sure that the moment you did run into them, that you could immediately assure them that you were somebody there to help them, not somebody there to hurt them. I mean, from a practical matter, just because some Western-looking guy shows up on the doorstep, it's no assurance to them that you're not working for Saddam Hussein. And Samir started talking to him. He introduced himself. He said, "I'm here to see you." He said, "I have a letter from your wife, and your son, Andrew, sends his love." Samir told the man that he knew where he lived, and he was going to come see him shortly. And said, don't be surprised, and don't be afraid. I'll come and knock on the door." And Samir hung up and went to the house, and he knocked on the door a few times, and nothing happened. And he knocked a few more times, and the door opened lightly, and Samir looked at him and handed him a letter from his wife and said, I'm here to help you. Please let me in."
Eager to send news to his family, the American composes an overdue reply.
"I have given up almost all hope for this to end soon. The pendulum swings from day to day, playing havoc with hope and our emotions. There is one strong desire that keeps me going on and on each day. That is my love for my family and my commitment to seeing all of you again. I love you all."
Bidding farewell, Samir promises to return and lead the Americans to safety.
A lot of the people who were in hiding knew the whereabouts of other people in hiding. So once we got to our one hostage, we were able to quickly find out where the other people were that we were trying to get to. And that was the opening of the flood of information that we needed to find the other people and to start moving forward more quickly with our escape plans.
Returning to Baghdad, Samir is greeted at the border like an old friend.
Samir's relationship with the officer in charge of the border detail meant that when Samir showed back up there, it was a wave, a handshake. "How you doing? How you been? Good to see you. I'll be back in a couple days. Take care."
In Baghdad, Rex links up with members of the Iraqi resistance to Saddam Hussein. They provide a safe house to hide the Americans.
One of the things you look for is a place in an area that will provide anonymity and cover that's easy to get in and out of without a lot of people noting the traffic. So that's one of the things that you're very conscious of as you're searching for a safe house.
3 months after the invasion of Kuwait, the team executes the last step of their mission, and the most dangerous.
It's one thing if you get caught being a false trading company and not able to produce the supplies, but it's another thing if you get caught with hostages.
To get the Americans out of Kuwait, Samir turns the Iraqis' greed against them.
Iraqi officers were looting the city of Kuwait, and so it was a matter of finding a truck driver who might be willing to take some other things without knowing what they were, might be willing to close his eyes while you had some things put into a truck, and was willing to do it for a reasonable price, and if you paid a little bit more money, maybe he'd pay even less attention to what you were putting in the back of the truck. This was a tough part of the operation. Samir had to go out and knock on doors. People he hadn't talked to before, he hadn't seen before, he had to get them to answer the door, convince him that he was somebody trying to help him, not hurt him, cross an open space into the back of the truck, get them hidden, and get the truck on the way. And move on to the next house where he had to do the same thing again. So this was a very fast-moving part of the operation. There was no room for error or mistakes. They were all astounded that somebody could find them. They were equally astounded that Samir was a friend and that somebody was indeed there to rescue him. If somebody keeps calling your name at some point, you'd rather answer the door than have them knock it down and come in with guns ablazing. Any one of these guys could have refused to come out, which would have hurt the operation, or could have come out and started yelling and screaming because he thought something was happening to him. So this was a dangerous part of the operation.
Samir, we have to get down. Don't worry about it. We got to get down. We got to go.
Of the hostages we rescued, we brought one of them out all by himself, and he really had no idea what was going on. He was really trusting Samir. He was in a truck. He was hiding.
I knew I was on my way. I knew I was out of that one place anyhow, and I had to feel like we were going to get out. But I didn't have enough of a description of my tour that I was about to go on to really feel good. And had I gotten one, I'd be scared stiff. So probably better that I didn't.
After weeks and weeks of hiding out in houses, evading Iraqis, hoping they would never be found, they suddenly all found themselves hidden away under piles of boxes and furniture in the back of a truck, about to be taken on a journey that they hoped was going to move them out to freedom. And with luck and careful planning and careful movement, that within a few days they might be home in the United States with friends and family.
In the sands of Kuwait, rescuers smuggle a handful of Americans past the army of Saddam Hussein, en route to safety.
There was the one border crossing, and indeed Samir already knew the officer in charge of that place, so the truck passed through quickly and silently, and once it got to Baghdad, most of the military activity was focused on a potential military operation against Iraq, not on whether or not they ought to be looking for people running around that city who shouldn't be there.
When the hostages returned, were brought out of Kuwait, I was waiting at the safe house. Samir brought them to the safe house, offloaded them into the safe house without any incident whatsoever.
Small private home. Nothing in there that gave me any hint to who the owners were, like no pictures or no paintings. I immediately almost fell asleep, but it was pretty tense.
At that point, the next step was to get them from Baghdad to Jordan.
And when I got into the truck, the manager gave me $5,000. Rolled up, water. Put that in there. I had my passport. That's all I had. I didn't have a toothbrush.
You can imagine the expectations of both us and them to be so close. It's the crucial moment, the one time you're hoping that the Iraqis haven't decided they're going to clamp down that border and take extra special security precautions. And indeed, the truck was able to move very quickly across the border into Oman, and that was it.
When I got there, all I was doing was figuring how to get my body on an airplane and back to the United States.
And at that point, we were able to call the company and tell the company that we had got your people and they're safe.
When I got off the airplane, the first thing I did, I knelt down and kissed the ground. It was great.
2 months later, Kuwait itself was liberated. Saddam Hussein's defeat was nearly as swift as his victory. Operation Desert Storm took just 72 hours. Cowan's cover operation was still running on fumes.
One of the things that was gratifying about how well we had put this operation together was some months after we were all done, we were still receiving faxes from the Iraqis asking where their stuff was. It was just nice to know that whatever efforts we had done to start this coverage had worked. Because clearly they believed we were a legitimate operation, and they believed that right up to they quit hearing from us.
In the annals of covert operations, the Kuwaiti rescue is now a legend.
There's no greater feeling than that sense of accomplishing a mission just the way you want to, and that's the way we all felt when this is done. It was something we didn't get to enjoy after our earlier trips into Beirut. In this case, we ran our own operation, and it was a mission accomplished.